Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MTGO Traders. My name is Tyrant, and this is the Rivals of Ixalan set review for White. Okay, so if you guys have been keeping up from the last week, I actually was down a couple days thanks to a cold, and then I'm kind of still dealing with that today with some nasally stuff. But I really want to kind of go through the cards now that they've all been spoiled, which they've all been spoiled in a single week, which is insane, and just kind of go through each one and see if it's good for draft, if it's good for sealed, if it's good for standard, and maybe even modern or commander. But let's get right into it, guys. We have a Baffling End here, 2-mana enchantment. When Baffling End enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or less, and when Baffling End leaves the battlefield, target opponent creates a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token with trample. Baffling End, for me, in draft and sealed, is fantastic. A 2-mana removal spell, an exile spell at that, for a mana cost 3 or less creature. Now, it does have the offset ability of where when it does leave the battlefield, it does give our opponent a 3/3. However, the amount of enchantment removal that you're kind of going to run into in game 1 or even game 2 of a draft format is sort of low. So I feel like Baffling End is going to basically be just a premier 2-mana removal spell for us in draft and sealed. This card is probably just primarily for draft and sealed. We probably won't see this in constructed at all. Unless we have some other cards from the set that actually kind of go along with this as far as some synergy. But for the most part, this is a draft and sealed card only. It's going to be better than average, and it's going to be one of those cards that if you're in the color white, you definitely want to bring into it or pull into it because it is fantastic removal for you in that color. Next up here we have Bishop of Binding, a 4-mana 1/1 vampire cleric. When Bishop of Binding enters the battlefield, exile target creature and opponent controls until Bishop of Binding leaves the battlefield, which is fantastic already. When Bishop of Binding attacks, target vampire gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the power of the exiled card. Bishop of Binding is a fantastic blowout rare for us in draft and sealed. I might say this will see some sort of standard play, as it does have a secondary ability once it does exile a creature. My only concern here is that it is just a 1/1, so there's a lot of removal in the format in standard that makes this card kind of bad, and probably enough removal in the format in actually draft too to make this sort of not good. But I do think that the exile ability is great for removal, but also having the ability whenever it does attack out that it can get another target vampire +X/+X, that meaning itself or another target vampire on your side of the field. So one that might have evasion like flying or something like that. Bishop of Binding to me is would hopefully be like a pack 2 rare for us. I think that this is a card you're probably going to want to pull into if you do get this as your rare in draft and sealed. It's just a fantastic removal spell overall, and can be a really great attacker if you do get a large creature like a dinosaur or something like that. I do think it's good for that. However, I do think in standard it's going to be kind of hard pressed to kind of make any kind of a splash there, since the +X/+X only happens whenever it attacks and not whenever it just exists, which I feel like would have been a much better use of the ability here. It's really going to die like a Magma Spray or in a Braid or something like that, where it's just like 1 point of damage. Even in like the regular Forerunner cards in the set, where it just does 1 point of damage to everything on the field, can kill the Bishop of Binding, and I think that is no bueno. Next up here we have Blazing Hope. This is a 1-mana instant. Exile target creature with power greater than or equal to your life total. This card is super interesting. I feel like it can be very good in draft and sealed depending on where you're at in the game, obviously. But if you're kind of drafting into this card, I feel like it's going to be a very low pick for you just for that very reason itself too. I'm not really that excited about this if I get into it early in the match, like if it's early in my packs. I do definitely think this will wheel several times before someone tries to pick it up, because Blazing Hope really is only good if you're up against a heavy aggro strategy or a strategy where you know they have the advantage or upper hand. So this is definitely a sideboard card for me, bringing it into the white strategy if I know that I can just destroy a creature outright, if I know that I'm going to be taking a lot of damage in the beginning of the match. However, I do think this card has a lot of really decent modern consideration thanks to all the shock lands, the pain lands, the fetch lands, all those kind of things that actually, like, you know, ping your life total down much lower than your opponent's. I do think making like an Esper Death Shadow build or something like that will be interesting too with a card like this. I'm not saying that that's like a reality thanks to this card, but being able to exile a creature with power greater than or equal to your life total is quite good whenever you know that you have to have your health really low for cards like Death Shadow to work. I definitely think we'll see people probably tooling around with this in Modern. I don't think this will see hardly any standard play. We might see some standard play, but I don't really think so. There's just not a lot of cards in standard that really like use this card to its full advantage. And I think in Draft and Seal, this is probably going to be a card you kind of pull into if you know that you're in white and you kind of want some sideboard stuff against a fatter strategy. Then pull this in sideboard 2 or in game 2. But I do think this is a card that probably has more modern implication than anything else. Next up here, we have Cleansing Ray, a 2-mana sorcery. Choose one, destroy target vampire or destroy target enchantment. This is a super good card for you in the white strategy. It's a great way to, of course, have flexibility against multiple types of opponents. Definitely the blue-green with the enchantment, and of course white-black with vampire hate. I do think this card is going to be one of the lower picks as far as removal in the drafting set, but I do think it is super good against a game 2 strategy when you know what kind of opponent you're up against. I don't think this card is going to see any kind of play in standard or anything like that. It might see some play in Pauper, perhaps, because it does have flexibility in destroying a vampire and an enchantment. But overall, I think this card is just kind of one of those like mid-tier to low-tier cards for a drafting environment. Next up here, we have Divine Verdict, a 4-mana instant. Destroy target attacking or blocking creature. Super easy, super straight to the point, and fantastic removal in white. Again, it's an instant, so destroy target attacking or blocking creature, so you can do it on your turn or your opponent's turn against a larger creature than yours. And I think that's really good. This is going to be a drafting and sealed card only, though, not for standard or anything like that, for sure. Next up, we have Everdon Champion, a 3-mana 2/2 human soldier. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to Everdon Champion. We haven't had a card like this in standard in a while. I want to say the last one was Guard Gomazoa, and that was like Zendikar block and maybe reprinted in one of the core sets, perhaps. I can't remember exactly. But I do think this card is fantastic in white. It is double white though, so it's one of those cards where I feel like it's probably going to be in a more red-white strategy in draft and sealed instead of anything else. I don't think this card will see any kind of standard play, but I do like the ability here of being able to attack out with no fear, basically, and being able to maybe pump this a little bit in red-white or maybe into some red-green Selesnya kind of strategy. I think this card is a ton of fun and we'll definitely see a lot of high picks in the early game in draft. Moving on here from this, we have a fantastic artwork card. This is Exultant Skymarcher. Love the art here. A 3-mana 2/3 with flying, and that's it. 3-mana 2/3 flyer is fantastic in draft and sealed, and you're going to pick this every time if you're in white. Being a vampire also means that there are a lot of really great travel synergies with this card, and just being a 2/3 flyer alone means it's going to be super fun against a lot of strategies where you really have a lot of 1/1s against you in flying or 1/2s against you in flying, and a 2/3 just perfect at being able to get in turn over turn some great damage, as well as being able to block some great flyers as well. The double white is kind of disappointing here, but if you're in the vampire strategy, I think this card is going to be a high pick for you. The thing that I do think this card is missing, though, is lifelink. I feel like if it had lifelink, of course, it would be more like the Dwarves of Kaladesh, being a 2/3 flying vigilance and lifelink. But if it just had flying and lifelink, I think that would be fantastic too, especially because it is 2 white. Next up here, we have Famished Paladin. This is a 2-mana 3/3 Vampire Knight. Famished Paladin does an untap during your untap step, and whenever you gain life, untap Famished Paladin. I think this card is actually quite good after seeing it kind of with the rest of the set in draft and sealed, and I think it's going to be very good in standard because of all of the 1/1 lifelinkers in the standard format. Famished Paladin just has so much potential at being able to kind of get in turn over turn for 3 points of damage on turn 3, which is very good, and being able to even untap the same turn if you have creatures that have lifelink on your side of the field attacking in. So I think Famished Paladin is almost like the Nettle Sentinel in the modern elves strategy. So I feel like this is a very good card for us in standard and a fantastic, like, almost first pickable pick if you have a bad rare in draft, just because of the powerhouse of it and the ability to kind of untap as well as attack and basically have vigilance. So basically a 2-mana 3/3 with vigilance. That's what I'm kind of saying. So it's amazing. Moving on here, we have Forerunner of the Legion, a 3-mana 2/2 Vampire Knight. There's a whole run of the Forerunners here in each color, but we'll go over the white one first. When Forerunner of the Legion enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a vampire card, reveal it, then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. Whenever another vampire enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a fantastic vampire tutor for us, for one, and it's also a good way to kind of pump our vampires for the turn, which is fine. Ultimately, though, the reason this card is so playable in draft sealed and probably standard is the tutor ability for just 3 mana on a body, which is quite good. However, if it was 4 mana, though, I think this card would probably be unplayable. But since it's not, I think it's a fantastic beater, fantastic tempo gainer for us on the curve, and a great way to kind of get in our big bomb from our deck if we have a vampire that's our big bomb. Again, I do think in draft and sealed, if we are in the black-white vampire strategy, pulling into this guy into the mid to late like packs or second pack is fantastic, because we do know that okay, we have one great vampire bomb. Let's get into the forerunner here. So if we have basically a bomb and then a bomb tutor, I think that's great. Moving on here, we have Imperial Seratops, a 5-mana 3/5 dinosaur with enrage. Whenever Imperial Seratops is dealt damage, you gain 2 life. In the like more dinosaur tribal strategy in draft and sealed, this card is not bad. The card is a 3/5, and of course whenever it gets damage out to it, we do gain 2 life, which is fantastic. My problem with it is the 5 toughness for 5 mana. I feel like it probably should have been 6, maybe even 7, depending on like what other not vampires, what other dinosaurs are in the format. I do think having 3 power here is okay. That's fair, especially when we would kind of get in turn over turn against other opponents, because we do want to try and trigger this for some life gain. If not, we can actually just use this as a blocker. However, if it was a blocker, it probably would have been better as a 2/5 for 4 instead of 5. And that's kind of, I feel like, where R&D went with like the design of this card. But I do think overall this card is quite good. It probably like one of the last like 14 or 15 slot in a dinosaur deck in draft and sealed, not standard of course. Okay, moving on here, we have Legion Conquistador. This card was actually reprinted from Ixalan back into Rivals of Ixalan. I'm assuming just for the ability to have multiples of these in the draft environment here. This is a 3-mana 2/2 vampire soldier. When Legion Conquistador enters the battlefield, you may search your library for any number of cards named Legion Conquistador, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. Again, this card is good because you can get into several Legion Conquistadors, and the more you get into, the better the card is, because it does 1, thin your deck, 2, give you a body on the battlefield, you know, and 3, kind of go off on the vampire synergy on the battlefield as well. So I do kind of get why it's reprinted in Rivals of Ixalan. There are other cards in Rivals of Ixalan that got reprinted from Ixalan that kind of like make me scratch my head. But this one I kind of understand, because it does mean you get into more of them throughout the drafting process. Getting into 4 or 5 of these guys is actually quite good if you do have the ability to do that. But of course, getting into 1 or 2 of them is terrible. They're only good in numbers, and only if you have terrible passes from your drafting pool. So that's why it's kind of good and bad at the same time. Next up here, we have Luminous Bonds, a 3-mana enchantment aura. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block. So basically a pacifism here for 3. That's not bad. Sadly, it's no arrest in that it doesn't shut down any of their effects or anything like that. But I do think just having a pacifism for 3 is pretty good in draft and sealed. It's basically going to be a removal spell for you for 3, and it's going to be always probably a high pickable card for you in draft and sealed. Of course, this is a not standard playable card at all. Next up here, we have Majestic Helios. Is that how you pronounce it? Helios? I guess so. A 4-mana 2/2 dinosaur flying. Whenever Majestic, what I just said, attacks another target dinosaur you control, gains flying until end of turn. So this is one of the cards where you pull into, if you're in the dinosaur pool, you have a lot of dinosaurs in your deck, you have a lot of big bombs in your deck. This is the card that gives your other dinosaurs, you know, the ability to fly for the turn over turn, which is really good for being an uncommon here. To kind of get in for the final points of damage. I do think overall Majestic Helios is very good for you if you're in the dinosaur strategy. However, if you are not, this card is kind of bad, and you should probably pass it on up and go for something a little bit cheaper on that front end. But a 4/4 2/2 flyer, or a 4-mana 2/2 flyer, is kind of bad. I kind of want to hopefully like a 2/3 or a 3/3 for 4 flyer, you know. However, I do think the secondary ability to make the dinosaurs, our target dinosaur, have flying is quite good. Again, if you're in a dinosaur strategy, get into it in draft, but if not, stay far away from it. And of course, don't use this in standard. Next up here, we have Martyr of Dusk. Fantastic art for this card, by the way. It's a 2-mana 2/1, which is already good. When Martyr of Dusk dies, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So this is a great card to go with the Paladin we talked about earlier. A 2-mana 2/1 is good, because it's basically a bear for us, but when it does die, it gives us another creature, which is a 1/1 with lifelink, so it gives us some life back. This is basically a Doom Traveler, but the Doom Traveler doesn't have flying, and that is fine. And I do think at the 2-mana slot for the vampire decks in draft, this is a perfect card for that deck as well. Martyr of Dusk is going to be probably a high pickable card if you're kind of going into a low mana curve for white. Next up here for us for white is Moment of Truth, a 1 white mana instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You gain 2 life. This card is super good for being in white. It feels like it should be in green and not white, but holy Jesus, this card is great. I think this is going to be a fantastic way for us to be a great battle trick to kind of get around like swashbuckling or get around any kind of other combat tricks our opponent is throwing our way. Giving another creature +2/+2 for just 1 mana is super good, especially in white, and having us gain life on the side as well is very good. This is going to be a card that's going to be in the more like tempo-based deck for the vampires, and of course that +2/+2 gain 2 life. We can also probably get that +2/+2 on a 1/1 vampire with lifelink, just like with the Martyr of Dusk kit there, and be able to kind of swing out for 3 more points of lifelink damage, get in for 3, and get ourselves 3 life back. I think this card is fantastic good. I think this card is going to be highly pickable. Next up here for us, we have Paladin of Atonement, a 2-mana 1/1 Vampire Knight rare. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you lost life last turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Paladin of Atonement. When Paladin of Atonement dies, you gain life equal to its toughness. This card I feel like might be very good in Draft and Sealed, or might be very terrible in Draft and Sealed, depending on what you have in your actual sealed pool. Getting into a 2-mana 1/1 that's a rare for your pack, but also has kind of an ability that needs to be very synergistic with other abilities, means that this card might just be a dead card for you in your draft pool, which is not a good thing to have. Now in Standard, I feel like this card might actually be pretty good in a Bantu's Last Monument deck or something like that. We kind of want to see what that happens, or what happens moving forward. I think this card has a lot of potential for that, but I do think Paladin of Atonement overall is probably a card you don't want to get into in Draft and Sealed unless you get into other pieces of the Vampire strategy where you can lose some life. The Paladin has some really great ability there to kind of grow, become a 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, and so on. But the problem is that that might not actually happen in Draft and Sealed. This card might just be used as a blocker, as a 2/2 or 3/3, and then just die. So that's kind of the thing that I'm kind of worried about with this card, especially since it's a rare. So it's just kind of one of those cards that I feel like it's only good for Standard, maybe, to be a brew around. Moving on here, we have Pride of the Conquerors, a 2-mana instant with Ascend. And of course, Ascend is if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. If you have the City's Blessing, those creatures get +2/+2 until end of turn. I think this is a great way to end a match if we have the City's Blessing for the black-white vampire strategy in Draft and Sealed. This is going to be a Draft and Sealed only card because Ascend is going to be one of those situations where I feel like while you can get it out more frequently in Standard, the +2/+2 for 2 mana is more of a Draft and Sealed kind of a combat trick for us to close out a match. Some might argue that this is kind of a Sheffet Dune style card for Standard for us, especially if we have lots of creatures on the battlefield to close out a match. And I think they're right. However, I think that putting a pump spell like this into a main board deck in Standard is probably the wrong way to go about it. So I feel like this is probably just going to be relegated to a Draft or Sealed card only. Again, if you're in a vampire strategy or any more white-red aggressive strategy, Pride of the Conquerors might be a card you want to pull into, but you might want to pull out of it or kind of pass it up if you don't have a lot of great creatures or synergistic cards to be able to kind of get to that Ascend mechanic. Moving on here, we have Radiant Destiny, a 3-mana enchantment with Ascend again, and as Radiant Destiny enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1 as long as you have the City's Blessing. They also have Vigilance. So it's basically a 3-mana like +1/+1 for a particular creature type, which is very good, which makes this card very Standard playable in a lot of different builds, but also giving them Vigilance if you have the City's Blessing. So against a or in a more like a Catcher Monument deck for vampires, or a mono white or black white deck for vampires, or even like a white green Merfolk deck. I mean, I don't know. This card could be in a bunch of different builds for us. I think this card is very good, and I think the Ascend mechanic would be very good in Standard. However, in Draft and Sealed, I feel like this is probably just a +1/+1. Ascend might not be going off as often as you think, but I do think this does make a strategy, if you're getting into a particular creature type in Draft and Sealed, so much better if you have white on the battlefield. Anthem effects in Draft and Sealed are usually very good, and it does mean that basically you can change the course of the battle by making the same creatures, the 2/2s versus 2/2s, be a 3/3 versus a 2/2, which usually can basically make you win the match by itself. For me, this card is good in Draft and Sealed, but I feel like this card is going to be even better in Standard, where we can kind of brew around it and build the cards we want to build. Next up here we have Raptor Companion. This is another reprint from us from Ixalan, a 2-mana 3/1 dinosaur. That's a vanilla creature. And, you know, I feel like it was bad in Ixalan. It's going to be bad in this set. I don't know why it got reprinted. I think for balance reasons it got reprinted. But for me, this card is just kind of terrible. A 3-1 that dies instantly to anything on turn 3 attacking in is not good for us. Of course, the offhand here is that our opponent can have the ability to kind of get in for 3 points of damage with the Raptor Companion on turn 3 if we don't have a turn 3 play. However, again, Raptor Companion just dies immediately, so I'm really not that big of a fan of it. Moving on from Raptor Companion, though, we have Sanguine Glorifier, a 4-mana 3/3 Vampire Cleric. When Sanguine Glorifier enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on another target vampire you control. This is kind of the Merfolk mechanic we saw from Ixalan, but kind of used in the vampire slot here, and I think that's perfectly fine. We basically had this effect from Jade Guardian in Ixalan, but of course that guy, or that Merfolk, had Hexproof. So I feel like if this card had some secondary ability like Lifelink, I would like this card a lot more. Sadly, without that, it is a 3/3 instead of a 2/2, so it can become a 4/4 for 4, which is quite good. Actually, no, it can't. It says another target vampire, so it's just a 3/3 and it has to put another one. So I do think this card is actually okay for a vampire strategy in Draft and Sealed if you have a lot of vampires on the battlefield, and I think this card is kind of bad for us in Standard. So we definitely want to look into this card for only Draft and Sealed, but not for Standard at all. Moving on here, we have Skymarcher Aspirant. This is a 1-mana 2/1 Vampire Soldier. Fantastic card for us. Has Ascend, and of course it has Flying as long as you have the City's Blessing. So this is basically a fantastic 2/1 flyer if we have Ascend, or just a great 2/1 for 1 on the curve for us in Draft and Sealed. This is going to be a pretty high pick for us for a white strategy for us for vampires, or any kind of red-white strategy. And of course, getting Flying as a 2/1 for 1 is super good. So I think this card will probably see maybe some like brew around Standard play, but I don't think this will probably be as important as you think in the Draft and Sealed environment. For Ascend, I just think that a 2/1 for 1 is good. Moving on here, we have Slaughter the Strong, a 3-mana sorcery. Each player chooses any number of creatures he or she controls with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures he or she controls. This card is interesting. It's really kind of, you know, like Elspeth's negative ability here. I really don't know about it being very useful for us. Of course, it's going to be, you know, a basically like board wipe for a dinosaur strategy, of course. But against any other kind of strategy, this is probably just going to be a sideboard card for us, or a way to get rid of their like 1 bomb that's on the battlefield. Slaughter the Strong, I am kind of sad that it is the rare instead of an uncommon here. It feels like an uncommon to me personally, but I think this card is going to be very good against a dinosaur deck in Draft and Seal, and that's where it's going to get used. I personally don't see this seeing any more play in a Standard, just because there are a lot of more token-based strategies and smaller creature-based strategies in Standard. I do think this might be good against some energy decks, against like the Hydra and like a Long Tusk Up, something like that maybe. But for the most part, this card's probably just going to get passed up on. And that's sad because like the art is really good too. Here we have a Snubber Century, a 1-mana 0/3 dinosaur with Ascend, and Snubber Century gets +3/+0 as long as you have the City's Blessing. A 1-mana 0/3 that can turn into a 3/3 with Ascend is freaking amazing. But again, Ascend is one of those mechanics that I feel like might be just terrible, and we really don't know that yet until we get into Draft and Sealed. The problem I have with Ascend, of course, is that the Ascend mechanic needs 10 or more permanents. So getting this as a turn 1 play as an 0/3 is decent, because it does mean it has a great ability to block several creatures. And becoming a 3/3 later in the match does mean we have some flexibility and viability for a card that was just a beginning of the turn play. So I think this card is very good at being a early game and mid game advantage card, but of course getting to Ascend in Draft and Sealed is going to be one of those situations that I really want to see happen, that I don't know when or what turn that may happen at. We'll just have to see how it kind of shakes out. In Standard though, I think this card is probably not going to get used at all, which is kind of sad because it's a really fun mechanic here. Next up here for us, we have Sphinx's Decree, a 2-mana sorcery. Each opponent can't cast instant or sorcery spells during that player's next turn. So this is basically a way to get around like some sorcery speed removal, or any kind of sorcery speed card draw from our opponent, or any kind of bounce spells, or anything like that. I think this card's okay. It's going to be used probably in Draft and Sealed to shut down an opponent maybe once or twice in game 2. But for the most part, Sphinx's Decree for me is not that great. I don't know if it's because I lack the imagination to use this card, but I feel like it's probably just not going to get used at all in Standard. And it's probably just going to see like maybe 1 or 2 uses in Draft and Sealed. So if I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments below. But I feel like Sphinx's Decree is one of those cards that it's interesting and it shuts down our opponent for 1 turn basically, but it doesn't stop them from playing creatures, it doesn't stop them from playing enchantments, and it doesn't stop them from you know, still attacking out. So That's kind of the thing that kind of like annoys me. And of course, being a sorcery too means we can't do it during our own turn too to shut down our opponent against like control magic, things like that. And I feel like this card is probably more useful for that situation, but we can't use it for that, so that's kind of annoying. Moving on now, we have Squires Devotion, a 3-mana enchantment or enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. And when Squires Devotion enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink. This is almost a cartouche like from Amonkhet here. And it's very good. Having +1/+1 and lifelink is very good for us at being able to kind of gain some life back, but being able to create a 1/1 vampire with lifelink is also very good because it means we're going wider too by paying a 3-mana enchantment aura. My only kind of like problem with this card is that it doesn't really give our opponent, or it doesn't really give our creatures any kind of first strike, vigilance, anything like that, any kind of sort of evasion against an opponent's creature. But giving +1/+1 is a little bit better than expected. Would have wished for a +2/+2 to make it a little bit more fair. But +1/+1 and lifelink is fine. Making a vampire token is gravy too. But again, this is only going to be a draft and sealed card and not used in standard at all. Just too expensive for that. Next up, we have Sentinel, a 2-mana 2/2 human soldier with vigilance. That's it. This is really simple, really fun, and probably going to be picked pretty highly in the draft and sealed pool because of the vigilance. Vigilance makes everything kind of awkward to deal with in combat because, of course, if they attack out, then they have the ability to still block. So our opponent has the options of either they die on the trade or they die on the attack. So Sentinel is basically like a baby's first combat, being able to train our opponent or our own self, being able to understand how attacks kind of work with a vigilance creature. Being 2/2 is not bad because it's basically a bear with vigilance, and that's fine. Again, this card probably won't be used at all in standard at the moment because humans really don't have any kind of synergy at all, and it's seemingly only really here just for the value play. Next up here, we have Crested Pterodon, a 5-mana 2/5 dinosaur with flying, and when Crested Pterodon has vigilance as long as you control another dinosaur. A 2/5 for 5 with flying is not terrible, I guess. It is kind of okay playable with the 5 toughness there. Having vigilance when you have a dinosaur, though, does make it a lot better, but I do think this is probably going to be a pretty low pick for you unless you're in the dinosaur kind of pool. And I think this card is going to be one of those cards that, like, you kind of going to be our 14th, 15th slot for our creature curve. This card's not going to see any kind of standard play at all, but I do like that it does get vigilance if we have another dinosaur. So we definitely want to look forward to that, but more often than not, this card's probably going to get passed, which is, again, sad. Next up here, we have Temple Atlasaur. This is a 5-mana 3/4 dinosaur rare. If a source would deal damage to another dinosaur you control, prevent all but one of that damage. So basically just getting off in rage. I think this card is super good in draft and sealed, honestly, because it does have the ability to just kind of shut down an opponent's attack strategy and mean that you can continue to attack out and basically trigger enrage on all of your creatures. However, this card, of course, is a glass cannon in that it isn't like protecting itself if it does have to block or attack out. But of course, if you just play out a 3/4 for 5 and just not attack out, you know, I feel like that's fine based on the ability that it does have. Of course, cards like Raptor Companion still die. I think this card might be useful in a standard. I kind of want to see a brew around with this ability or this idea, but I don't think this card will probably make any kind of huge waves in standard, just based on it just being a 5-mana creature. I feel like there are a lot of other 5-mana slot dinosaurs that it can be used in standard that are a lot more impactful. So this is probably just a draft and sealed rare only. Moving on, there are 2 more cards for us in white here. There is Trapjaw Tyrant, a 5-mana 5/5 dinosaur with enrage. Whenever Trapjaw Tyrant is dealt damage, exile target creature and opponent controls until Trapjaw Tyrant leaves the battlefield. This card is so good in draft and sealed. Basically, if it does any kind of damage against a creature, it can exile that card if it doesn't destroy it, basically. Or when it does get dealt damage by a blocker, it can exile another card, basically removing 2 cards from our opponent's battlefield. This card is a card that's basically going to end a match if they have no way to deal with it with removal spells on the next turn or that turn. I feel like this card is incredibly powerful and might see some play in some weird build in standard, basically just being an exile card if you have enrage. Of course, if the Trapjaw Tyrant does die, everything that it did exile does come back, so that is the downside though. But I feel like how draft and sealed is kind of like operating right now, I feel like Trapjaw Tyrant will stay alive long enough to at least get 2 or 3 creatures and end up the match. I think this card is super good, guys. It's going to be a card that's going to be a huge mythic bomb for you to pull into draft and sealed pool. And the last white card for us at number 30 is Alpha Primal Dawn, a 8 mana legendary creature elder dinosaur at rare. It's a 4/8 with flying, double strike, vigilance, trample, and indestructible. Again, this is going to be a super bomb draft sealed card for you. This will probably not see any kind of standard play because it's so expensive. We might see some standard play just depending on what kind of happens in the green situation for standard. But I think this card is a card that if you pull into it and they don't have an answer on the next turn because it doesn't have haste, then our opponent just dies. They just die on the spot. This card is stupid good. And if they don't have any removal, then you know, you're dead. You're dead. But that is all the white cards for us for today. Let me know what you think of the white cards in Rivals of Ixalan. I feel like there's a lot of really great synergy, especially for vampires in white. And there are, of course, a couple good dinosaurs, but I feel like a lot of them are going to be mostly in green and red as far as having a lot of potential and power. There are a couple good removal spells in white, but more often than not, there's going to be a lot of great synergy just for vampires. But please let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Of course, like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next color for the review.